So this video is about the time period known as Reconstruction, as in reconstructing the United States after the Civil War. And here's a nice graphic. You don't need to memorize any of these statistics, but it'll give you some ideas as to the losses suffered in the Civil War. You can see this is in the Revolution, War of 1812, Mexican-American War, and then the Civil War Union forces and Confederate forces. Here are the totals, including battle deaths, other deaths, and wounds not mortal. That means when people were injured but they weren't killed. So hit pause for just a couple of seconds and take a look at this graphic. On April 15th, 1865, there was a history-changing event. It took place here at Ford's Theater, right up in these seats here. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. And had he lived, without a doubt, history would have been different than it was. That didn't happen, but Abraham Lincoln is remembered today, amongst other things, by having his face on the $5 bill. And obviously he has a memorial in Washington, D.C. When he was killed, his vice president became president, Andrew Johnson, and he is going to have a lot to do with Reconstruction. Okay, the goals of Reconstruction. The original goal was to reunite the nation and rebuild the economies of the southern states without slavery. Lincoln's goal was to reunite the nation as quickly and painlessly as possible. This is important, especially this word painlessly. After the Civil War had been won by the North, there were many Northerners that wanted to punish the South, and that would have caused more animosity between the North and the South. And Lincoln said, let's take the South, back into the United States with as little pain as possible. However, the radical Republicans, maybe you remember that Lincoln was a Republican and that the Republicans were trying to stop the expansion of slavery, and the radical Republicans' goal was to support the free slaves but punish former Confederates. Now, after the Civil War, there were, within 5 years or so, 3 amendments added to the Constitution, and these are known as the Reconstruction or the Civil War Amendments. And these, again, are going to change the future of the United States from this point. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, 3 years later, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Basically, this says that anyone born in the United States was automatically an American citizen. And maybe you remember that African Americans were not considered citizens before this. And the 15th Amendment prohibited the denial of voting rights based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And this says that all people have a right to vote, regardless of their race or their color. Now, there are some important aspects of Reconstruction, some important terms, and we're going to go through these now. And these are the ones that we're going to go over and that you're going to need to know. Carpetbaggers. How did lawmaking in the South change? The Freedmen's Bureau, sharecroppers, black codes, Jim Crow laws, radical Republicans, the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK, Plessy versus Ferguson, and there are some other things at the end we'll take a look at. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved south after the war to exploit Southern economic woes or troubles. Things for the South were going really bad after the Civil War, and there were a lot of people that didn't have a lot of money, and there were some Northerners who went down south to try to make what little money they could off of these Southerners and their troubles, and they were called carpetbaggers. Now, state legislatures in the South, a legislature, maybe you remember, is a group of people that make laws. And these are state legislatures in the South, and they're going to change as well. And they're going to change because many white Southerners began to support African American leaders. And this makes sense because the 4 million or so freed slaves by 1870 have the right to vote, and that's a gigantic voting population, and many white Southerners are going to pick and choose what African American leaders they want to support because they know that those leaders are going to get a large vote out of the African American newly freed people. The Freedmen's Bureau, this is a photograph. Freedmen's School, you can see all African Americans who had been previously slaves. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an organization established by Congress to aid freed slaves and poor Southerners as well. And they provided things like food, clothing, and education after the end of the Civil War. Sharecroppers, again, this is another photograph taken probably not long after the Civil War. This was the name given to the large amount of landless farmers, farmers that didn't have land in the South after the war. And it basically continued the slave relationships legally. What happened with sharecroppers is a lot of these newly freed African Americans didn't know what to do after the Civil War. Before the Civil War, when they were slaves, yes, they were in bondage, they were property, but they were given food and they were given shelter and possibly even a small amount of money. And after the Civil War, that had all changed. Well, what were they to do? They didn't know what to do with their lives. And there were some that went back to farmers and said, I'll work for you, give me a job, let me work here. And some farmers allowed that to happen. And it really wasn't much better than slavery, but it was legal. Black codes and Jim Crow laws. Black codes were codes or laws severely limiting the rights of freed men in the South. Whenever you see this term, freed men, you're talking about people, individuals who were slaves and were now free. So free African Americans in the South, and these black codes, which they weren't official in some sense, but they were codes, kind of unwritten laws that really limited the rights of freedmen in the South. And Jim Crow laws were laws in the South that enforced the segregation of the races. Very important term here, segregation. Do you know what that means? Segregation means keeping the races separate. Here's an example of some black codes. So in a second here, I'd like you to pause the video and read some of these. They're pretty powerful. And these were laws enacted by a number of southern state legislatures or lawmaking bodies. So pause the video and take a look at these and kind of reflect on them and ask yourself what life in the South must have been like for a newly freed African American. Okay, the radical Republicans, we talked about them just a little bit at the beginning of the video. Andrew Johnson, when he became president of the United States after Lincoln's assassination, the way he handled Reconstruction was in some ways similar to Lincoln's. He was lenient with many of the Confederates. He didn't feel that punishing them was necessary, and the radical Republicans didn't go for that. They thought the South should have to pay for the crime of rebelling against the United States. And many radical Republicans also believed that the South should have to pay for the war, pay to rebuild anything that was destroyed down there in the South and in the North as well. The Ku Klux Klan, this is an interesting drawing. Can you see what's going on in this drawing? It's actually a little bit frightening, really. African American family, and then maybe you can see this. The Ku Klux Klan was a secret society, meaning that they wore hoods, white hoods, to protect their identities. A secret society that opposed civil rights, particularly voting rights for newly freed African Americans. They did not believe that newly freed African Americans should have the right to vote. And as Reconstruction continues and as time passes, actually the KKK is going to gain more and more popularity, and more and more people are going to join. Now, the KKK is still around today. This is a photograph. It's probably 10 years old. They are around today, but they're really kind of a small group. They're fairly quiet about their beliefs. You don't see many uh, Klan rallies going down Main Street, or going down populated areas. Now, you should keep in mind that even though the KKK was clearly a racist organization, they believes that white people are superior to really all minorities. They do have a right to share their views in public as long as it's peaceful. They're guaranteed that in the First Amendment. So while what's happening here may be a little upsetting to you, it is perfectly within their right to protest and to march as long as it's done peacefully. And again, the KKK is still around, but they're not nearly as large a force as they used to be. Now, Reconstruction eventually is going to come to an end. And this is with the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877. There was a dispute on the election of the president in 1876. And there was a compromise made due to that election. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of this because this is something you'll probably learn when you get to 11th grade U.S. history, which picks up during the time of Reconstruction. But you just need to know that this is really the time that Reconstruction formally comes to an end. Now, the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction continues even to today. Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896, again, not long after the end of the Civil War, that said that in schools you could have young black children and young white children separated into different buildings as long as their education was kept equal, which, as you can imagine, it didn't remain equal. And this is going to be a very serious court case that's going to be overturned in 1954. We'll get to that in a minute. You can see this is during the Civil Rights Movement that the racial tensions between African Americans and Caucasians continued long after the Civil War. Okay, here you can see in 1954, segregation in public schools ended by the court. And this was called Brown versus Board of Education, famous Supreme Court ruling that said that you can't segregate students by their color. You had to integrate. You had to have schools where you had minorities in the same classes, in the same buildings as the white majority. And this really changed the United States in a huge way. And then, of course, in the 60s, you had Martin Luther King, who was a vocal advocate for equal rights for everyone. Not just African Americans, by the way. He fought for equal rights for everyone. And maybe you've heard his I Have a Dream speech, very famous. And unfortunately, he was assassinated as well. Okay, a picture of the Civil Rights Movement, which took place in the 1960s and 70s. And some people would say it's still going on. And eventually, you're going to have African Americans rising to a high point of power. This is a man by the name of General Colin Powell. He's a four-star general, African American. And then, of course, today we have an African American president. And you can see that just in the last 150 years or so, that things have changed so tremendously, not just for African Americans, but for minorities in this country. And I would ask you to reflect on that and just think about how different things are in just really a hundreds or so years since the Civil War. So this concludes this video. As usual, if you have any questions or you need clarification, please see me as soon as possible.